Hi, I'm Anoosh.
And I'm Ailbhe.
And on today's New Statesman podcast, we're joined by our polling expert, Ben Walker, to talk about the issues of the day. And then in You Ask Us, we're joined by our political reporter, Freddie Hayward, to talk about the privatisation of Channel 4. We're delighted to be joined again by our polling expert, Ben Walker, who's been incredibly busy the past few weeks launching a new project. State of the Nation is a new poll, election and numbers site launched by the New Statesman for understanding why is Britain like that. It hosts trackers that help cut through the noise and contribute to some of the oft discussed issues of our time. How popular is Boris? Who would win an election tomorrow? Will Scotland vote for independence? Where is unemployment highest? Who has fallen into fuel poverty? And so forth. If you haven't seen it, please go and check it out. It's a brilliant resource. It's at sotn.newstatesman.com. But Ben, we're here to ask you a few more topical questions today in a sort of extended version of You Ask Ben. One of the questions from our listeners is, do the raw numbers in the polls show an actual increase for Labour over Starmer's leadership, or is it more a case of the Tories losing voters to apathy or other parties than Labour? I know we've spoken about this subject before, but let's see if that trend has persisted in the polls since we last discussed this.
Yes, so thank you for having me once more. And to be honest, since I started popping on, we've had that question asked every week. We have talked about that question every time.
Give the listeners what they want, Ben.
and it's an interesting thing. Do the raw numbers in the polls show an actual increase for Labour over Starmer's leadership, or is it more the case of Tories losing voters to apathy? Obviously, it has for the past few months, the past 6 months maybe, been an answer in the latter case. It is a case of more of the Tory party losing its supporters to apathy rather than Labour gaining. Now, just to give you a brief rundown of what the numbers are today. We are recording on Thursday, the 7th of April. Labour have a lead over the Conservatives of 4 percentage points, down from around about 5 or 6 percentage points from about a few months ago. But to be honest with you, the Tory vote share has been pretty static now. What has been driving that has been a lot of the Tory base now saying they're undecided, they're apathetic, they don't think they'll vote again, so they're staying at home. Because of the war in Ukraine, however, a bit of the Tory base has come back a little bit. They're now a little bit more engaged in politics, but it's very little. It's very small. And that is why Labour still has a lead in the polls. Nonetheless, though, we do keep talking about the Tory voters being apathetic and staying at home. Let's not ignore, though, that Labour are netting some support. We have a little bit of evidence to show that Lib Dems are a lot more receptive to voting Labour. You know, if they had a second vote, but a lot of Lib Dems would use that second vote to vote Labour. They wouldn't have done that years ago. They are doing that now. You have in some new converts. You have voters who didn't vote last time saying they would come out for Labour this time. So Labour's getting a lot of some non-voters back, which is actually quite key. It's worth bearing in mind what happened in 2019. Labour lost a lot of its supporters, not just to the Tories, but to apathy. A lot of them stayed at home, and a lot of those are now coming back into the game. A lot of them are now saying, hey, I want to vote now. So it's not a case of just the Tories being apathetic or Labour actually gaining support. It's a bit of both. It's a bit of nuance.
So, Ben, I have another question for you, which has been, I'm pleased our listeners asked, because this has been plaguing me for a while. So polling figures seem to show that Boris Johnson was actually already unpopular when he came into office. We speak all the time about Boris Johnson's popularity and his optimism and the way Conservative MPs really value that in him as a leader, despite maybe not sharing all of his politics. But if he was actually already unpopular when he came into office, how did he get such a huge majority in 2019? And listeners have asked, is that result the reason why people talk about him as such a popular figure? And could that sort of big 2019 landslide happen again, even if his popularity appears quite low?
One unique thing about Boris Johnson is that he became Prime Minister when more Brits disliked him than liked. He was unpopular from the outset. We don't normally get that with prime ministers. When Theresa May entered office, she had a net approval of plus 20, plus 30. When David Cameron entered office, he had a net approval of plus 20, plus 30. When Gordon Brown entered office, he had a net approval. Tony Blair, net approval. John Major, net approval. Margaret Thatcher, net approval. Boris Johnson didn't have that, okay? But it didn't matter. It didn't matter because the other guy, the opponent, the opposition, Jeremy Corbyn, was even more unpopular. It's not a case of their
So
unpopularity
depressing.
in the extreme. It's more, why are you all laughing? I can hear all of that.
It's just such a depressing state of affairs, isn't it?
Yeah,
The least wildly unpopular person wins.
Yeah, it is quite depressing. It's the least unpopular wins, but that is how it is. In 2019, the reason Johnson did so well against Corbyn was that Corbyn was even more unpopular, and he was like minus 30 in terms of net approval compared to Johnson, who was minus 15. And that mattered. It's the gap that matters, really. You rewind back to 1987, Neil Kinnock versus Margaret Thatcher. Neil Kinnock had like a net approval of also minus 30, but Margaret Thatcher had a net approval of minus 20. So that's what helped her rather win so well. We are in different territory, however, now, which is that Johnson's net approval is quite abysmal. It's at the lower level of Gordon Brown. It's at the lowest level for what Theresa May got. And it's pretty much at the bottom of where even David Cameron temporarily hovered in 2013. He's at rock bottom now. Keir Starmer is also more disliked than liked, but the thing, he's at minus 6. Johnson's at minus 20, minus 30. Okay, and it's the gap between those two that matters. Now, let's just bear this in mind as well. Johnson has never been a popular figure across the country. He has, however, been popular where, regrettably, it matters. We live in a first-past-the-post democracy. Not all votes are equal. Some seats matter more than others. Marginal seats obviously matter more. And in the marginals that mattered last time round, very leave-heavy, very few graduates, average incomes below the average. These types of seats, these types of voters living there were more receptive to Johnson, were more receptive to his views, his politics, than the nation at large. And, this gap between Johnson and Corbyn in 2019 was already wide across the nation as a whole. But in the marginals that mattered, that gap was so much bigger.
That's so interesting. And moving smoothly on from Boris Johnson's fall in popularity to Rishi Sunak's, Ailbhe and Andrew Marr had a really interesting discussion a couple of podcast episodes ago about how Sunak's chances at being a future Tory leader plummeted with the response to his spring statement in light of the cost of living crisis that we're all living through. To what extent does the cost of living crisis affect the public's perception of the Chancellor's credibility on the economy? I remember George Osborne's omnishambles budget. 2 years later, the Tories won a majority. Do these kind of things really affect the perception of the Chancellor? Or does it poison his party rather than himself?
To tell you the truth, having a whinge about the cost of living, having a whinge about fuel bills, tax rises, we do it on the daily, don't we? We always do it. And so it feels quite normal to think about the cost of living, have a moan about it. But to tell you the truth, we are in new ground. Voters care about the cost of living in a way they didn't in 2012, they didn't in 2008. The way we look at the economy is not the same way we looked at it in 2008 or in any other recession before. It's more personal. It's more about people's finances, people's fuel bills. In 2008, it was about unemployment. In 2012, omnishambles, it was also, again, about unemployment. And these were issues on which the Tories were able to gain ground on. They started talking about long-term economic plan, that overused, done-to-death line, for years. and it worked, right? This time, however, they're not talking about a long-term economic plan because voters don't want to hear about a long-term economic plan. They want to hear about the cost of living. And the problem with Rishi Sunak's budget/spring statement was rather it didn't talk about the cost of living in a way voters wanted. A lot of voters looked at the measures. They looked at national insurance. They thought, nice. Yeah, I agree with that. Fuel duty, I agree with that. But the vast majority, 60-something%, said this doesn't help me in the way I need it. It was a spring statement that fiddled at the edges and didn't do anything that impressed voters. And this is Rishi Sunak. This is the COVID chancellor, the one who had a net approval of plus 30. And now it's at -1 or -2, depending on the pollster you're looking at, really. He has really fallen from grace. He's not this political messiah anymore. He's just a very normal politician. What it exposes, really, is that his popularity gain during the COVID years, or the first year of COVID, was that it was situational, not intrinsic. Sunak's favourability has collapsed because he has not grappled with the main pressing issue of our time, which is the cost of living.
I actually have a bit of a follow-up question to that, Ben, which is quite topical this morning. As you say, we're recording on the morning of Thursday, the 7th of April. And of course, last night, the news broke that Rishi Sunak's wife has non-domiciled tax status in the UK, which means that she has possibly saved up to millions and millions of pounds in taxes on foreign income. I'm wondering, this isn't so much about Rishi Sunak's wife as, do we have polling yet on public perceptions of Rishi Sunak's wealth or his in-touchness, for want of a better expression, with the general public? Because, it seems clear that this is becoming more and more of an issue for him. This is, not the first time that his wife's financial affairs have come up in recent weeks. Also, there was a story a few days ago about a donation to his alma mater, Winchester College, of over £100,000. Just wondering, has that cut through yet? Has the extent of Rishi Sunak's wealth been noticed by the public, and do they mind?
To be honest, talking about a rich politician doesn't have as much a pull as perhaps we think it does. Nonetheless, perceptions of being out of touch, though, that matters. I think there was a piece put out somewhere which said that Rishi Sunak is too rich to be Prime Minister.
That was Claire Foge's column in The Times, which was quite punchy.
Yeah, I look at that and I think disagree with that, because voters look at stinkingly rich people and they think, I would like to be stinkingly rich too. And they don't particularly think this is something that disqualifies you from being Prime Minister. We are a snobby country. We look at class and we think if you've got the right accent, if you look well dressed, you look more prime ministerial. And that's one of the contributing reasons why David Cameron looked more prime ministerial than Ed Miliband, and why he continually led Miliband on it, right? When it comes to Sunak's wealth, I don't think voters have noticed they're calling a Conservative a rich man. That's not news. I don't think voters are going to sort of pay attention to that.
I've done quite a lot of research, and actually we've got some new pieces coming out in our Class Attitudes in Britain polling project. And people, when asked, actually cannot draw a line for how much is too much wealth. In general, people are not put off by the fact that public figures or politicians are wealthy. In fact, it is seen generally as aspirational. And we've got one last question for you, Ben, before we move on to the second part. And it's a bit of a change of topic. With the bias towards the Conservatives that First Past the Post gives, and the lack of a revival in Scotland, what is the average point lead that Labour would need to win in the next election to have at least a majority of one?
It's always worth bearing in mind the country doesn't swing as one. You have certain people, certain voters, certain parts of the country that are a lot more enthusiastic about a certain politician or party. So uniform swing is not always helpful. Nonetheless, obviously, the New Statesman has an election calculator, as does State of the Nation. It's the same one. It's called Britain Predicts. And what we say is that for Labour to have a majority of one, it needs a 9 to 10 point lead in the polls. Now, that's pretty big. That's pretty stark. That's larger than anything the Conservatives need to have a lead. The Conservatives start losing their majority after a 2-point lead over Labour. The way votes are distributed in this country now is that the Conservatives do have a net advantage, and Scotland as well. Labour are very much have a tougher task to go. However, it is worth bearing in mind we are in new times. Tactical voting is coming in a way that we haven't seen since perhaps even 2010. What kept Labour up in seat numbers in 2010 was that so many Lib Dems were at least willing, in a great many seats, were willing to tactically vote Labour to keep the Conservatives out. Didn't work in the end in terms of coalition formation, but that's besides the point. Nonetheless, voters are a lot more willing, a lot more able now. Lib Dems are a lot more willing to vote Labour. Labour voters are even perhaps willing to vote Lib Dem in certain seats. And you see it in by-elections. You see it in Birmingham and Erdington, where the Lib Dem and Green vote share was completely at the bottom. You saw it in Old Bexley and Sidcup, where the by-election there, where the Lib Dem and Green vote was at rock bottom. North Shropshire, the Labour vote, rock bottom, Lib Dem gain. There is a willingness now with voters on the more progressive wing to split their votes, change their votes, just to stop the Conservatives winning. And I think that could have quite a sizable impact, but let's not overstate it. Voters, the vast majority of voters don't pay attention to politics in the way we do. The average voter pays 2 to 5 minutes of attention a week to politics. That's not much, to be fair. And so when it comes to tactical voting, we do risk overstating it. But nonetheless, it has come about in a way we haven't seen since 2010.
So interesting. Thank you so much for joining us again, Ben. And I should remind our listeners again, if they want to see more of Ben's data and polling analysis, go to sotn.newstatesman.com.
Yeah, thank you.
Hello, it's Ailbhe here. This is just a reminder that as a podcast listener, you have the option of subscribing to The New Statesman with a very special offer. At the moment, you can subscribe from £1 a week. That's 12 weeks for £12. If you go to www.newstatesman.com/podcast offer.
From the New Statesman World Review comes France Elects, a special podcast series exploring the main candidates and the big issues shaping the campaign to be France's next president. I'm Ido Vogt, and over the next 2 months, I'll be joined by special guests to dissect incumbent Emmanuel Macron's record, his rivals to the right and left, and key issues such as foreign policy and the climate. Just search World Review on Acast or wherever you get your podcasts.
And now it's time for a section we like to call
You Ask Us.
And this question is from Nick. Thanks for sending it in. What on earth are the Tories hoping to achieve by privatising Channel 4? Could it really compete with big beasts like Netflix and Amazon? And what might it mean for the channel's political and news output? And to join us to try and answer this question, we're delighted to have Freddie Hayward, our political reporter, on for his debut on the New Statesman podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me.
Welcome, Freddie.
So you've been looking into this story, Freddie. So can I throw the question to you first, if you don't mind? What really is behind this? Because, I mean, I remember the Tory government trying to privatise Channel 4 a long time ago under John Whittingdale as Culture Secretary, and they just decided it wasn't financially worthwhile. I think Oliver Dowden was also saying it, a predecessor to Nadine Dorries. So are they serious this time?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting question because you don't find people baying for the privatisation of Channel 4. It's not something that dominates political conversation in the UK at the moment. But as you say, it has been a theme of the past 5 years or so. John Whittingdale, the Culture Secretary in 2016, tried to bring it about, but it didn't actually happen. So what we've had a consultation last year, and the government have decided that they want to press ahead with it. But that doesn't mean it's going to happen anytime soon. So they're going to release a white paper setting out their plans imminently, and then it needs to go through Parliament. So I think that is being said at the moment. So they're looking to hopefully get it into law by the next general election. But whether that comes to pass is a completely different question.
And what's interesting is that the official line is that they want, I think you had a quote from a government source saying this, that it's just about business. They want it to be more competitive in this admittedly more competitive media environment, whereas there are cynics sort of perhaps on the left or on the liberal left or in television itself who are saying this is kind of ideologically motivated. Channel 4 is generally seen, or at least Channel 4 is generally seen as the news channel perhaps most hard work for a poor minister doing the media rounds.
Yeah, no, it is interesting. The government have said they want to privatise Channel 4 so they can compete with the big streaming giants in the US, whether that's Netflix or Amazon. But there's some disquiet about what the true reasons are. I mean, Julian Knight, the chair of the DCMS Select Committee, has intimated that it might be about revenge for Channel 4's coverage of the Tories during the Brexit debate. So that's another angle to it.
Well, it's funny as well, this question about whether this is about business or is it about revenge, because on the business front, that case that this would make Channel 4 more competitive has been challenged by people with knowledge of how this kind of thing works, that pretty much the amount that Channel 4 can invest and borrow and so on is already determined by the government. If the government wanted Channel 4 to be more commercially competitive, it could simply give Channel 4 the right to do that without selling it off. But secondly, this question of whether it's sort of revenge for the perceived sort of left-leaning slant of Channel 4 News is funny because this is, I've heard lots of Conservative MPs refer to this as a solution without a problem, because ultimately, if you are trying to hit Channel 4 in response for negative news coverage, you don't really fix it by privatising it, because ultimately it's really unlikely that anyone who buys Channel 4 will change the news direction. I mean, there's a possible case that actually if you really want to capture that audience, you would make it even more hostile to the government, just to keep that audience happy. But actually, that probably, because of the public service broadcasting requirements that Channel 4 has adhered to for so long, I think it's really possible that future buyers of Channel 4 wouldn't actually seek to change that, and they would just leave it alone. Like, it is actually possible that the government thinks that they're going to change the slant of the Channel 4 news output, but all they do is either not change it at all or make it more hostile to them.
Yeah, I think that's so funny, isn't it? Because at the moment, Channel 4, its remit isn't to make a profit, is it? And so if that remit changed, it might even have to double down on some of that content that perhaps some Conservative MPs find so egregious, because that's its audience. I think it's the only broadcaster that is drawing in that younger audience at the moment. I don't know whether I'm right about that, Freddie.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And when you do try and look at what the government is trying to achieve with it, it's quite interesting when you put it in the context of levelling up and the government's agenda for its parliament. When it was elected in 2019, one of the key things they said is they want to try and level up the country. And while that's stayed a really vague concept thus far, Channel 4 was one of the ways in which that you actually saw some concrete progress. So, for instance, they opened a HQ in Leeds. They've got creative hubs in Bristol, in Glasgow. 2/3 of their commissions happen outside London. So they were one of the core vehicles of trying to address some of the regional inequalities that the government spoke about. And if you did privatise it, then you're throwing in a profit motive there, which might not lead to the channel taking those riskier decisions to move staff around or commission more alternative content.
And they're not actually allowed to make their own content, are they? They have to invest in British independent production companies.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, because they've got this unique publisher-broadcaster model, so that means that they don't actually produce any of their programmes in-house. They outsource it to independent production companies around the country. So that also massively contributes to moving the creative industry to different regions outside the southeast.
We've got a great piece actually by James Graham, the screenwriter and playwright who's done a lot of stuff for Channel 4, which basically says that trying to compare Channel 4 to something like Netflix is like trying to compare a sheep with a lamp. I mean, is that unfair? Is there any way that Channel 4 could possibly be a competitor with these big beasts, as our questioner asks?
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting because they're completely different things. If you look at the streaming industry at the moment, it's highly competitive. All the companies are trying to fight for market share, and they're creating a lot of debt to be able to do that. But that's not what Channel 4 is. Channel 4 was created by Margaret Thatcher to compete with the BBC and the ITV to try and provide an alternative and slightly different coverage for the UK. So they are just different things. And if you do try and throw it out into the broader world with the bigger streaming giants, it might not be able to fulfill that original purpose.
Great. Okay, well, that was really helpful, and I hope that answered your question, Nick. Thanks so much for joining us, Freddie. I'm sure we'll have you back on again soon.
Thank you very much.
You've been listening to the New Statesman podcast with me, Anoosh Chakelian, and my colleague Ailbhe. We're produced by May Robson, and our music is Devil with the Devil, licensed under Creative Commons. Thanks so much for listening, and don't forget to subscribe and leave us a nice review.